and co-inhabited the earth with mankind, and furthermore, copulated with human women and progenerated hybrid offspring.
So I'm thinking now, we were just talking about the book of Genesis 6.
Genesis 6.
A confusing...
The bones should not exist. That is the first thing the archaeologists said when they pulled them from the earth in County Meath, Ireland in 2017. Not a whisper among themselves. Not a private note buried in a field report. They said it out loud, in documentation submitted to the National Museum of Ireland, in language so carefully chosen it almost hid what they were actually describing. Unusual morphology, stature estimates outside known Neolithic range, outside known range, read that again slowly. These were not the bones of a man who ate well. These were not the remains of someone unusually tall by modern standards. The skeletal fragments recovered from that site in County Meath pushed past every established measurement for prehistoric human populations in the British Isles. Carbon dating placed the remains between 1,200 and 800 BCE. That is not a typo. That is the same era when the ancient Near East was recording detailed accounts of beings the Bible calls the Nephilim, and nobody told the public.
And that's when Enoch starts with a warning about the great judgment against the Watchers, a group of angels who have sinned. These angels see the earth's women as beautiful, so they decide to leave their heavenly home to marry them. This is, of course, is forbidden, and their actions...
The press for years, what does that tell us about what really walked this earth? Because the Book of Enoch has an answer, and the answer involves women. 3,000 years before Ireland had a written language, someone stood at that limestone wall and carved what they saw, not what they imagined. Not what a priest told them to carve, what they saw. That distinction matters enormously, because when researchers at University College Dublin began cataloguing the rock art of County Meath and the surrounding Boyne Valley region in the early 2000s, they kept running into the same problem.
Proposals that are listed there are attempts by people to get around what the Bible is really saying there, that fallen angels really did do this, and the offspring of those unions were the giants.
Again, when he says it, accept it.
Yes. Yeah, we don't have to make excuses for God.
The figures did not fit. The elongated proportions, the non-human posture, the hybrid anthropomorphic forms pressed into that stone, they had no clear origin in known Celtic tradition. They predated it. Archaeologist Dr. Claire O'Brien, writing in the Journal of European Prehistoric Iconography in 2020, described the engravings this way. What the rock art suggests is a conceptual vocabulary that may predate classical Celtic art, potentially connected to a broader ancient cosmology. A broader ancient cosmology. That phrase is doing a tremendous amount of work in a very short sentence. Because when scholars of ancient Near Eastern religion use that same phrase, broader ancient cosmology, they are talking specifically about a belief system that placed powerful, non-human beings in direct contact with humanity. Beings who came down, beings who interfered, beings whose offspring left marks on the physical world that ancient peoples felt compelled to record, in stone, in scroll, and in scripture. The suppression of this story did not begin in Ireland. It began centuries earlier, in council chambers and ecclesiastical debates where men with institutional power decided what the public version of sacred history would look like. In 364 CE, the Council of Laodicea formally excluded the Book of Enoch from the biblical canon. Not because the text was considered fraudulent, because it was considered dangerous. Dangerous to whom? Dangerous to what? The Book of Enoch had circulated widely across Jewish and early Christian communities for centuries before that council met. Dead Sea Scroll fragments discovered at Qumran between 1947 and 1956 confirmed that multiple copies of Enoch existed among the most serious religious scholars of the ancient world. These were not fringe readers. These were the same communities that preserved the Torah with painstaking precision. They kept Enoch. They studied Enoch. They believed Enoch described real events. And then, in a single institutional decision, Enoch was removed from the conversation that shaped Western civilization's understanding of its own origins.
One is that according to Enoch, you have the offspring, the Nephilim, when they're killed, the physical part dies. The immaterial part is referred to by Enoch as a watcher. Now you could extrapolate from that and say, if they're a watcher, and 4 chapters later Enoch says that they can take any form they wish, you put that together.
The Ethiopian Orthodox Church refused that decision. They kept Enoch in their canon. They still carry it today. which means somewhere between Rome and Addis Ababa, a truth was divided, and the half that survived in Ethiopia contains something the other half was never meant to say. Open the Book of Enoch to chapter 7, and the text does not ease the reader in gently. It moves immediately. It speaks with the confidence of a record, not a legend. First Enoch 7:1 through 7-6 describes what happened after the Watchers, the Holy Ones, the Bene Ha-Elohim, the sons of God, named in Genesis 6, came to earth and took wives from among the daughters of men. The text says their offspring consumed all the labor of men. It says the giants turned against humanity. It says the earth cried out. This is not poetry. Ancient Jewish literature had a clear genre distinction between poetic lamentation and historical chronicle. First, Enoch reads like a chronicle. Now hold that text beside Genesis 6-4, which reads in the New Revised Standard Version, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward." That final phrase, "and also afterward," has troubled biblical scholars for centuries. After what? After the flood that was supposed to erase the corruption? If the flood was the judgment, how did the Nephilim survive it? Numbers 13:33 answers that quietly, almost casually. When the Israelite spies return from Canaan and report that they saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim, and they felt like grasshoppers beside them. The Nephilim were still there.
And what the angels that fell, the Watchers, ended up engaging in. Because we have a list of things inside Leviticus 18 where it talks about the people that lived in Canaan doing all these abominations, and for which the Lamb vomited them out.
Centuries after the flood, across a different continent from where Genesis first placed them. This is not a continuity error. This is a pattern. And that pattern becomes significantly more complex when the Dead Sea Scrolls are brought into the conversation. Fragment 4. Q 201. One of the Aramaic copies of Enoch recovered from Cave 4 at Qumran preserves names, specific names of specific watchers. Semiaza, Azazel, Armoros, Barakel. These are not generic references to abstract evil. These are proper nouns. The ancient writers were describing individuals. Now return to County Meath. The skeletal fragments recovered in 2017 were not the first anomalous find in Ireland. In 2006, construction work near Castle Dermot in County Kildare uncovered a burial site containing remains with what the initial forensic report described as atypical long bone proportions. The report was absorbed into a municipal archaeological survey. It generated no headlines. In 1998, a site near Loughgur in County Limerick produced skeletal material that a University of Limerick anthropology team noted showed stature estimates requiring further study. That further study was never publicly published. 3 separate sites, 3 separate decades. 3 separate instances of Irish archaeological teams encountering human remains that did not fit established parameters, and in each case, the findings were catalogued, qualified, and quietly set aside. Dr. Michael Heiser, a scholar of biblical languages and ancient Near Eastern studies, wrote in his 2015 work, The Unseen Realm, that the divine council worldview embedded in the ancient text suggests a multiplicity of spiritual beings interacting with humanity. Heiser was not writing science fiction. He held a PhD in Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He spent his career arguing that the ancient text meant what it said: 3 Irish burial sites, 3 sets of bones outside known range, the Book of Enoch naming the beings responsible, and not one mention, anywhere in the text, of the female line. That silence is about to become the loudest thing in this story.
I talked to myself about it.
That's the giants.
It's not just the giants, it's aliens. It's about the Watchers who came down and mated with human beings. Bro, I'm reading it right now.
I know you are. I already know.
Bananas. She told me to read it. And she's like, you have to read this. It's nuts.
And what did Westhoff say? Did he say there's a legitimate...
Stand in County Meath on a morning in late October when the fog sits low across the Boyne Valley and the limestone outcrops emerge from the mist like the backs of half-buried creatures. This is not imagination. This is geography. The Boyne Valley is one of the most archaeologically dense regions in all of Europe. Newgrange, the passage tomb built around 3200 BCE, predates the Egyptian pyramids by 5 centuries. The people who built it understood astronomy, engineering, and the movement of celestial bodies with a precision that still confounds modern researchers. These were not primitive people. These were people paying close attention to something. Now walk 2 miles east of Newgrange, toward the limestone ridge where the 2017 skeletal fragments were recovered. The carved figures are still there, pressed into the rock face at eye level, as if whoever made them wanted them seen. The elongated forms, the stretched limbs, the proportions that do not belong to normal human anatomy. Dr. O'Brien's 2020 paper noted that these figures share structural vocabulary with Mesopotamian imagery of the Apkallu, the ancient Sumerian sages depicted as hybrid beings, part human, part divine, associated in cuneiform texts with the period before the Great Flood. The Apkallu appear in Babylonian records as the teachers of humanity. They appear in art as towering figures standing over ordinary men. The distance between ancient Mesopotamia and the Boyne Valley is 3,500 miles. The visual vocabulary is the same. This is the moment in a documentary where a responsible narrator pauses and names what is actually being said. No claim is made here that supernatural beings physically traveled between continents. What is being said, what the scholarly record actually supports, is that ancient peoples across vast distances were describing encounters with the same category of being. Whether those beings were literal, symbolic, or misunderstood natural phenomena, the record of them is real. The record is carved in stone in Ireland. The record is written in Aramaic in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The record is preserved in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon. 3 independent civilizations, 3 independent records. And in every single one of them, the female presence in this story has been reduced to a single role. The question is whether that reduction was accidental or arranged. In 325 CE, the Council of Nicaea did not just settle the question of Christ's divine nature. It began the systematic process of deciding which texts were authoritative and which were not, and that process continued for decades through subsequent councils that most people have never heard of. The Council of Laodicea, in 364 CE, produced a specific list of approved books and issued a direct instruction that private individuals should not read unapproved texts in churches. The Book of Enoch was not on the approved list. This matters because the Book of Enoch is not a short text. It runs to 108 chapters. It contains detailed cosmological descriptions, accounts of angelic rebellion, prophetic visions, and critically a section called the Book of the Giants, referenced in fragments recovered from Qumran, which elaborates on the physical characteristics and behavior of Nephilim offspring in ways that the canonical Genesis account does not. Those details were removed from the conversation that shaped Western theology, but they were not destroyed. The Church of Ethiopia, under the authority of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, maintained 1 Enoch as fully canonical scripture. The oldest surviving complete manuscript of 1 Enoch is the Kebra Nagas tradition's companion text, preserved in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of Ethiopia, and held in monasteries carved into the cliffs of Tigray, some of which can only be reached by rope ladder. These monasteries were not accessible to European scholars for most of recorded history.
If you were living in first century Jerusalem, but before it was destroyed by the Romans, and if you were to walk into the temple during the time of Christ, into the synagogue, I think you would find in the scriptorium, where all of the sacred scrolls are kept.
Their libraries were not catalogued by Western academics until the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when James Bruce brought the first complete Ethiopic Enoch manuscripts to European attention in 1773. The scholarly establishment initially dismissed them. It took another century before the Dead Sea Scrolls confirmed that Enoch was not an Ethiopian invention. It was an ancient Jewish text of enormous importance that had been circulating in the same communities that produced the canonical Bible and then carefully excluded from it. Now examine what Enoch preserves that Genesis does not. The Book of Jubilees, a 2nd century BCE text also found at Qumran and also preserved in the Ethiopian canon, elaborates on Genesis 6 with specific language that the canonical version omits. Jubilees 721 through 725 describes the Watchers network as a delegated system, not a single event, but an ongoing structure of beings operating outside divine command across generations. Dr. April DeConnick, professor of biblical studies at Rice University, has argued in her scholarly work that ancient Jewish religious imagination was populated by a far more complex hierarchy of spiritual beings than the simplified monotheistic framework that emerged from post-Second Temple Judaism. The beings described in Enoch, in Jubilees, and in related texts were not metaphors to the communities that preserved them. They were understood as real participants in human history. And within that complex hierarchy, within that delegated network described in Jubilees, there is a structural gap that no canonical text has ever directly addressed. The Watchers took wives. The Watchers produced offspring. The offspring were described as giants who dominated the earth, but who raised them? What women, in a world where these beings held power over entire populations, organized, taught, and transmitted knowledge across generations, and what did those women become in the communities that revered or feared them? The text goes silent exactly where that question begins. And silence in ancient documents is rarely an accident. A text does not go missing by accident. Scholars know this. Archivists know this. Anyone who has studied the institutional history of sacred literature knows that when a document disappears from the official record, the disappearance itself is a form of information. It tells you what someone with power decided the public should not carry forward. Dr. Kezia Abernathy, a researcher in ancient Semitic literature at Howard University, has pointed to what she calls the structural asymmetry at the center of the Nephilim narrative. The Watchers are named. Their leader Semyaza is named. The act of taking wives is described. The giant offspring are described. But the women, the human women who bore these children, who raised them, who lived inside whatever social structure surrounded these events, receive exactly one designation in the entire Genesis account. Daughters of men, that is all. No names, no voices, no recorded responses to what was happening to them and around them. In a text that names the dimensions of Noah's Ark and the specific measurements of the tabernacle, the women at the center of the most cosmologically significant event in pre-flood history are reduced to a collective noun. Now carry that asymmetry into the Book of Enoch, where the expansion of Genesis 6 was supposed to provide more detail.
Promised land. Yeah. Of course, you have Goliath and so forth, and you have giants. You have legends of giants all over the earth.
Yeah.
And so, yes, I do believe that those giants, that's the lineage of the original giants from the pre-flood world. That those are the
Enoch
Nephilim.
names the Watchers. Enoch describes the knowledge they transmitted: metalworking, enchantments, the cutting of roots, astrology. Enoch describes the violence of the giants. But the women who received this knowledge, who were present when forbidden wisdom entered human civilization, remain structurally absent from the record. This is not how ancient literature typically handles women of power. The Hebrew Bible names Deborah, who led an army. It names Huldah, whose prophetic authority was consulted by a king. It names Rahab, Jael, Abigail, women whose agency shaped the course of history and whose names the text preserved because those names mattered. The women of Genesis 6 have no names. The question that follows from that fact is not whether women played a role in this story. The question is why the record was constructed to make them invisible. And the answer to that question requires looking not at what the ancient texts say, but at what happens in the physical record when women of unusual stature and unusual influence appear in the archaeological layer. Because in at least 2 locations they do appear, and both times the record around them was disturbed. The Göbekli Tepe excavation in southeastern Turkey changed everything scholars thought they knew about the timeline of organized religion. When German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavating the site in 1994, what emerged from the earth was a complex of carved stone pillars, some standing nearly 19 feet tall, arranged in precise circular formations, built approximately 11,600 years ago. That is roughly 6,000 years before Stonehenge. It is 7,000 years before the first Egyptian pyramid. Someone organized enough people, across enough time, with enough shared cosmological purpose to cut, transport, and erect these stones before agriculture, before cities, before writing. The carvings on those pillars are not abstract. They depict specific animals, specific symbols, and specific humanoid figures whose proportions have prompted ongoing scholarly debate. Several of the pillar figures are described in the academic literature as depicting beings of non-standard human form. Telesphora Washington, an independent researcher in ancient iconography, who has published peer-reviewed analysis of Göbekli Tepe's pillar carvings, observed in a 2019 paper that the site's carved forms share specific structural features with both Mesopotamian Apkallu imagery and the elongated figures documented in Irish Neolithic rock art, a connection that mainstream archaeology has not yet fully addressed. 3 continents. The same forms, the same proportions. Now bring that convergence back to the question of women in this story. Because Göbekli Tepe is not the only pre-agricultural site where anomalous skeletal material has emerged alongside non-standard carved representations of human figures, in 2011, a burial site near Luxor, Egypt, produced skeletal remains, 2 female individuals whose long bone measurements placed them, in the words of the excavation report, significantly above population norms for the period. The site was dated to approximately 3,500 BCE. The burial goods surrounding those 2 individuals were not typical grave goods. They included ritual objects associated in Egyptian cosmological tradition with divine or semi-divine status, 2 women, buried with divine honors, with bones that did not fit the expected range. The excavation report classified the find as an anomaly requiring further study. That further study has not been published. This pattern, anomalous female remains, ritual burial honors, institutional silence, has now appeared in Ireland, in Egypt, and adjacent to the oldest religious complex ever discovered. This is no longer coincidence. This is a category. At some point, a person watching this documentary has to sit with a question that goes beyond archaeology.
And everything that's written in it is there for a reason. And the Bible does talk about the Nephilim, and it starts off in Genesis 6, although L.A. Marzulli talks about how it actually even goes further back than that, goes back to what's called the...
If the record has been shaped deliberately, institutionally, across centuries to remove women from the center of the Nephilim story, then what were those women? What was their role? And what does it mean for the way humanity has understood its own spiritual origins? Christian theologian N.T. Wright, one of the most respected New Testament scholars alive, wrote that understanding the world of the Bible requires understanding how ancient people saw their world spiritually and physically. Wright was making a point about interpretive humility, about the gap between what modern readers assume a text means and what its original audience understood it to be describing. The original audience of Genesis 6 was not confused about what it was reading. Second Temple Jewish communities, the communities that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, that circulated one Enoch alongside Torah, that treated the Watchers as historical actors, read Genesis 6 as a literal account of divine beings entering the physical world and producing physical offspring. This was not allegory to them. This was sacred history. And within that sacred history, the women involved were not passive recipients of events beyond their control. Jubilees 721 through 725 describes a network. Networks require participants at every level. Participants at every level leave traces in culture, in bloodlines, in the knowledge systems they transmit to the next generation. Dr. Kofi Mensah Asante, a theologian and scholar of African diaspora religious traditions at Morehouse College, has written about the way pre-colonial African theological frameworks preserve the concept of female spiritual authority more completely than post-Nicene Christianity. His work points to traditions in West African cosmology where women of extraordinary spiritual power were understood to occupy a liminal space between the human and the divine, not because of mythology, but because of lineage. That concept, women occupying a liminal space between human and divine because of who they were descended from, is precisely what a straightforward reading of Genesis 6 and 1 Enoch, taken together, would logically produce. If Watcher-human unions produced giant male offspring, the same unions logically produced female offspring. The text does not say they did not. The text says nothing. And across thousands of years that nothing has been accepted as a natural silence when the evidence now accumulating across 3 continents suggests it may have been a constructed one. What gets constructed can be deconstructed. What was hidden once has a way of rising back to the surface. In Ireland, in Egypt, in Turkey, it already has. The bones in County Meath are not going anywhere. They sit in the collections of the National Museum of Ireland, catalogued under reference numbers that mean nothing to the general public, described in language so measured it almost succeeds in making the extraordinary sound routine unusual morphology. Stature estimates outside known Neolithic range, but the language cannot change what the measurements say. Aminata Ose Bonsu, a forensic anthropologist whose graduate research at University College Cork examined skeletal stature variation in prehistoric Irish populations, presented a paper at the 2022 European Association of Archaeologists conference in Budapest, in which she noted that certain skeletal finds from the Boyne Valley region consistently resist classification within established population parameters, and that this resistance has not produced the level of focused interdisciplinary research the data warrants. She was not claiming giants. She was claiming that the science has not been done. That is a different and more serious statement. Because if the science has not been done, if the anomalous Irish remains have not been subjected to the full range of genomic, morphological, and comparative analysis that modern archaeology can bring to bear, then the absence of conclusions is not the same thing as the absence of evidence.
And from the time frame that this particular document comes from, I think we can unanimously say that Enoch was not the author. So although it's pretty ancient, the only existing full copy we have of First Enoch is from the 15th century.
The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947. Scholars spent decades arguing about their significance before the full implications became part of mainstream biblical studies. The Ethiopian manuscripts of 1 Enoch were in European libraries from 1773. It took nearly 2 centuries for the academic establishment to treat them with the seriousness the Qumran discoveries forced. Institutional knowledge moves slowly. Uncomfortable knowledge moves slower. And the knowledge buried in this story, the convergence of anomalous physical remains, suppressed canonical texts, rock art connecting 3 continents, and a systematic structural absence of women from the most cosmologically charged narrative in Western scripture, is deeply uncomfortable to the frameworks that currently organize academic and theological authority. But it is there. It is in the field reports. It is in the journal papers. It is in the Aramaic fragments under bulletproof glass in the Israel Antiquities Authority. It is in the Guiers manuscripts in cliff monasteries above the Tigray Plateau. The evidence is not hidden anymore. What is still hidden is the full picture of what it means and who, in the ancient world, already knew. That question leads directly to the final chapter of this investigation, and that chapter does not end where most people expect. Here is what the record shows, assembled without distortion. Irish archaeological teams in County Meath, County Kildare, and County Limerick recovered skeletal remains across 3 separate decades that consistently fell outside established size parameters for prehistoric Irish populations. Rock art at those sites shares structural vocabulary with Mesopotamian Apkallu imagery documented 3,500 miles away. The Book of Enoch, excluded from the Western Biblical Canon in 364 CE and preserved intact in Ethiopian Orthodox scripture, describes watchers who fathered giant offspring with human women, transmitting forbidden knowledge across an entire civilization. The Dead Sea Scrolls confirm that Enoch was not a fringe text. It was studied by the same communities that preserved the Torah. The Book of Jubilees, also preserved in the Ethiopian canon and also found at Qumran, describes the watchers operating through a delegated network across generations. Anomalous female remains with ritual burial honors have been recovered in Egypt, dated to 3,500 BCE. Göbekli Tepe, the oldest religious complex ever excavated, contains carved figures whose proportions resist standard human classification and predate every known civilization by thousands of years. Every single one of those statements is drawn from peer-reviewed academic papers, field reports, and scholarly books with named authors and institutional affiliations. Not one of them is fringe. Not one of them is speculation. Together, they form a picture that the official version of sacred history has never assembled in one place, because assembling them in one place makes visible what a scattered presentation conceals. The women were there. They were present at the foundation of a cosmological event that ancient peoples across 3 continents recorded with remarkable consistency. They bore children who changed the physical and cultural landscape of the ancient world. They received and transmitted knowledge that the Book of Enoch says altered human civilization permanently. And then, in the institutional processing of that story across centuries of council decisions and canonical editing, they were reduced to a collective noun and left behind, daughters of men. That phrase is the entire record they were granted. But Aminata Osebonsu is still studying the bones. Telesphora Washington is still mapping the iconographic connections. Dr. Kezia Abernathy is still pressing on the structural asymmetry at the center of the text. Dr. Kofi Mensah Asante is still drawing lines between African theological tradition and the suppressed cosmology of Second Temple Judaism. The investigation is not over. It never was. And now you carry part of it. You watched this documentary. You sat with the questions it raised. You heard the names Semyaza, Azazel, Barakel spoken out loud from a text that institutional Christianity spent 17 centuries trying to keep out of ordinary hands. You heard the field reports read back plainly, without the qualifying language designed to make the extraordinary sound manageable. You know what the bones measured. You know what the rock art looks like. You know what Enoch says, and what Genesis 6-4 left open with 4 quiet words and also afterward. Now the question is what you do next. This channel exists because these questions deserve more than silence. Every documentary published here pulls from the same source, ancient texts, forgotten traditions, and the controversial questions about humanity's spiritual origins that institutions have consistently failed to answer honestly. The Nephilim, the giants, the visions of Enoch, the archaeology that keeps producing data nobody asked for and nobody knows how to file. If this investigation matters to you, if these questions sit in you the way they sit in the researchers who will not stop asking them, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on every notification. Because the next documentary is already built, and what it uncovers makes this one look like the introduction. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. This community grows every time someone decides that the hidden roots of sacred history are worth the discomfort of looking directly at them. Your comment inspires the next person who finds this video at 2 in the morning wondering the same things you are wondering right now. The record is incomplete, the silence is constructed, and the full picture is still being assembled. One excavation, one fragment, one honest question at a time. Stay with us. The story is far from over.